to the Israels for sponsoring and for learning and for being our partners in so many things. And we obviously hope very much that our learning today should serve as an aliyah for his neshama, and he should, his neshama, he himself should continue to be a Meili Tusher, a supporter and an advocate for your whole family, for good health and good things, God willing. We should share in all of them together. So thank you so much for that. Okay, without further ado, Parshas Tisa. So this Parsha is, oh my gosh, there's too much to talk about. If we had a 30-hour, never mind a 30-minute Parsha share, we could never possibly cover all the fascinating things there are to cover. I feel like my lighting is a little funny. There we go. So I'm just putting that out there. As we all know, 30 minutes is never enough. But this week, oh my goodness, there are just too many things. So what we're going to do is really just focus on one question and offer a couple of answers. And hopefully through that, we'll have a chance to get a sense of some of the bigger ideas that I think are in this week's Parsha. So of course, Tisa is famous, infamous, I don't know what we want to call it, for being the Parsha where the Jewish people served the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf. And that sort of takes center stage. And the fact that there's 10 other topics in the Parsha don't even ever make it to the list, because that is such a prominent piece of Jewish history. It's part of our collective experience as Jewish people. We're going to talk about why it was such like a watershed moment for us, why it's something we come back to and something we talk about all the time, in particular around Yom Kippur, but really all the time. And so we're going to focus on that. But I just want to point out that there are a lot of other parts of this Parsha, but the sin of the golden calf doesn't happen until like almost 2/3 of the way in. Half, I'm not so good with guesstimating or with anything with fractions, but I don't know, half, 2/3 of the way in. But there is so much other content. There is so much there. And we're going to touch on a few of the things. So I won't bring them up now, but just, to keep in mind, if you want to have a chance to either hopefully hear the Torah reading in Shul this Shabbos, or certainly if you'll take the time to read it yourselves, like get yourself ready, sit down, get ready for a long ride. There is a lot there. So I'm going to share my screen now so we can all see the Parsha together. Here it is. Nope, that's not it. Here we go. Okay. So as I mentioned, lots going on here. But the first thing I want to address, actually, like I mentioned, is a question. I think that's maybe the only way we can sort of narrow down the field. And the question is the following. We're familiar, I'm not going to go through the story of what happens. The Jewish people had just received the Torah, and after seeing that Moshe didn't come down when they expected him, they really force Aaron to make them a golden calf, right? And that's essentially the story. And we know, famously, Hashem tells Moshe that this is what's happening. Moshe's up on Har Sinai. Hashem tells Moshe it's time to go home because the children are not behaving very nicely. And Moshe leaves and he goes down and he sees with his own eyes what is happening. And he very dramatically throws the luchos down from his hands, and then begins the process of both chastising and also rebuilding the Jewish people. And I left out a lot of the details. But for our purposes, I want to ask the following question. If Moshe knew from Hashem himself what was happening down below, right? Hashem gives Moshe a very accurate recollection of the events. Sometimes we have in the Torah where Hashem speaks to one person, like in the story where he speaks to Avram and says, oh, your wife said this. And he changes things a little bit. He gives Moshe a very accurate, he quotes him verbatim, the language of the Jewish people when they raise up this golden calf out of the pot of gold that they had melted. And Vayomru, right? And they say, Elah Elohecha Yisrael, right? This is your God, Jewish people. And Hashem says that verbatim to Moshe. This is what they just said, right? This is your God who took you out of Egypt. So Moshe really was fully aware. He had this very intense conversation with Hashem, and Hashem tells him the Jewish people are sinning. They've built a golden calf. He doesn't even say they're misbehaving. He doesn't hint at things. He's very direct, right? They are sinning. This is what they're doing. They've created some sort of masecha, some sort of, not a mask, like I don't know what the other word is, like a molten image, I guess. And it's bad. You better go down there quickly. And by the way, I'm finished with this people, right? I have no patience for them. They're an am kashay oref. I'm going to just start again with you, Moshe. Moshe's immediate reaction is, whoa. Hashem, you took them this far at all. You can't do that, right? This is not just about, you can't just make a new people from me. And he works with Hashem, essentially advocates for the Jewish people, eventually goes down, and then has to do a lot of up and down in order to sort of reconcile the two parties in this very difficult, very painful conflict that takes place. When the Jewish people sin like this, it creates tremendous, tremendous distance and conflict between themselves and Hashem. So the question is, if Moshe knew what was going on down below, and he probably might have expected that the luchos were not the appropriate thing to give to the Jewish people at that moment, right? It's not like he picked them up. The description is he's carrying the luchos and he keeps them in his hands, and then he chooses to go down that way. And then we know he throws them, he breaks them. So why did he do that? Now, there are some, I guess, halachic answers. There are some practical answers. There are some philosophical answers, some emotional answers, so many different approaches. So I just want to touch on, on a few of them. What I'm not going to focus on, because I want to focus a little bit more on the Parsha, but what I'm not going to focus on is an idea that I just think is always worth mentioning. And this is what we're not talking about. What we're not talking about is the imagery of broken tablets, the imagery of stone that is hard like a rock, and is completely and totally shattered. And it's an imagery worth mentioning because it's something that comes up, I think, very often, the image of a broken heart or a broken person, people who have suffered, people who have been through a lot. And the image of a person being shattered and the way that the luchos were shattered is something that I think it's hard to ignore, that very strong imagery. And of course, if we can put ourselves, past the initial shock of what happens when a person is feeling broken, when a person experiences something that is breaking, is of course what happens to the shivrei luchos, what happens to the shards, the broken pieces of the luchot, is that they are put right beside the whole second complete set of luchot that are not broken, and they're both put together inside the aron. And that is just, I think, a really powerful metaphor for life, that in the holiest kli, in the holiest vessel that existed in the Mishkan and eventually in the Beis HaMikdash, a vessel that was gold and wood, which we spoke about before, the imagery and all the different ideas that we could learn from the aron. But what we didn't talk about, what was inside the aron. What's inside the aron is something whole and something broken, because I think there is a recognition that at the end of the day, that is a reflection of the people. That's a reflection of our reality. And again, I didn't want to talk about that, but I somehow, when I say shivrei luchos, the broken tablets, I can't help but think of that image that I think resonates with a lot of us, that there is a lot of difficulty, a lot of pain, people feeling broken over different types of experiences that they've had, relationships and health issues and all sorts of things. And there's an acknowledgement here, I think, in the Torah that things can break, but they also can continue to be a part of who a person is. We take all those experiences with us. Okay, I'll leave that for now. So again, back to our question, why did Moshe bother bringing the luchos down? What was the point if he was going to break them anyway? Why couldn't he just leave them intact? So you could say that's one answer to the question, is a nod to the idea that we just mentioned. Let's talk about a couple of other ideas. The first idea is based on the Medrash in Shmos Rabbah, a very famous Medrash. I don't actually need to show you my screen for this part. A very famous Medrash that, hold on one second. Here we go. A famous Midrash, where you could see the closet in the background. That's not so pretty. I'm going to scoot over. Okay. A famous Midrash, but a Midrash that is really kind of difficult to understand. So I want to just take a moment to try to get through it. And that is, the Midrash says that when Hashem told Moshe that the Jewish people were sinning, Moshe didn't believe him. The reason why, according to the Medrash, Moshe brought the luchot down with him was because he didn't accept what Hashem had told him. I haven't seen it. It's almost like a la, 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 I didn't see it. I don't know what you're saying. You couldn't be talking about my children. I can't help but have images of parent-teacher conferences, the teacher's telling you something about your child and you're like, no, I don't hear you. Maybe some of you have had that experience. So Moshe is very much of the strong knowledge that the Jewish people are a good people. It's not possible that they could have done what you are saying they did, Hashem. I don't believe you. That's a powerful, powerful thing for the Medrash to say. is that real? Did Moshe not? Hashem doesn't lie. We say the Chot Moshe HaKadosh Baruch Hu is emes, right? The seal of God is truth. He doesn't lie. So what does it mean that Moshe didn't believe him? So one way to understand that is that Moshe is essentially teaching the Jewish people a lesson, right? When this would be written down afterwards by himself, but when he would be writing this story for the Jewish people to study for generation after generation, what they would see in this story, right? When they were looking at it with, I think, a keen eye, when they would ask this question, right? Because there's a lot of questions to ask, but when they would ask this particular question, what they would see from this is Moshe living by a principle to its fullest extent. No matter what, no matter who is telling me anything, if I haven't seen it, it's not real to me. And of course, we know that a person needs to be logical, rational. I never saw coronavirus, but, I believe that when I tested positive that I was sick. So I believe that it was a real thing, even though I couldn't see it. So I'm not talking about from a scientific perspective, but from an emotional perspective, from an interpersonal perspective, the psychological aspect is so telling that Hashem, even though we know that he would never have held anything back or misrepresented the Jewish people, Moshe is being a consistent leader. And he set an example for the Jewish people that until you have seen something for yourself, you don't have to believe the stories that you've heard, right? You don't have to accept as fact something that has not been proven. And proven means I've seen it with my own eyes. Now, we know when it comes to Jewish law and when it comes to the court system, like witnesses are sufficient and a person does, right? But what I'm talking about more is when we hear things about people, when we hear things about organizations or institutions, is to really reserve judgment, to wait until we have seen things with our own eyes, we've experienced it, recognizing that might actually be more painful, right? Because had Moshe held back, had he believed what Hashem said and accepted it as fact right away, he wouldn't have brought the luchos down. He would have probably kept them. He would have maybe mentally already started to prepare himself for what he was going to see, and he might not have had such a strong reaction, right? So there's a risk involved in not accepting things as fact until you see them, because then your reaction is going to be a lot stronger. In this particular case, that is one of the, it's a show, it's a sign of Moshe's strong leadership, that he comes down very hard on the Jewish people. After having just advocated and defended them to Hashem, he then comes down and yells at the Jewish people. And I think this is like a real act of parenting, where deep in his heart, we see what Moshe feels. Moshe feels a love and a passion for the continuity of the Jewish people. He believes in Bnei Israel. He believes in them. Who else would he be more honest with than with Hashem himself? So what he says about the Jewish people and how he believes in them and that they should continue and he should continue and Hashem should continue to be with them, that's really what he feels. And then when he goes down and he sees what's happening and he breaks the luchos and he yells at the people, he chastises them, rebukes them, punishes them, and all of that, we see that's almost like what the Rambam would say, almost, I don't want to say he wasn't angry, but like maybe he wasn't angry. He was, the way the Rambam explains it is a person is never supposed to feel anger. They're supposed to feign anger, right? You have to get to a place inside where you're not actually angry, and then you can interact with the person. You can pretend like you're angry. They can think you're angry, but God forbid you're never allowed to be angry. And so, we could sort of argue that Moshe put himself at a great disadvantage by doing it this way. And yet he did it for a reason. He wanted to see the whole story for himself. He wanted to experience it firsthand before he took Hashem's word for it, which sounds crazy, because to take Hashem's word for it, like our whole lives are based on the word of Hashem. So it's kind of ironic that Moshe would say, no, let me see for myself. And yet that's exactly what he does. And there is definitely a lesson there for us. Okay, a second approach to the question is along the same lines, but a little bit different, which is that Moshe knew as the leader that this is actually what Hashem wanted from him. In other words, it's almost like it wasn't a test for Moshe, but it was almost like another proof of why Moshe was the right leader for the people. Because who else would Hashem want for his nation? Who else would he want for his babies, for his children, if not somebody who would bend over backwards, do mental gymnastics to not see the negative in the Jewish people? And we know, incidentally, that in the Psukim, throughout the time that the Jewish people are in the desert, that Moshe has his challenges with the Jewish people, right? He gets very frustrated with them. He turns to Hashem and he's frustrated with them. He turns to the people and he's frustrated with them. He's a real person and they have a real relationship. It is challenging. It is not easy. And yet we see this is really one of the defining characteristics of Moshe, that when it comes to standing up for the Jewish people, to defending them, like to the end, he is with them to the end, right? If not, mecheni na misifracha, get me out of your book. I don't want to be the leader of the people that you're finished with, right? Then do away with my role. Take my name out of your book. I don't want to be there. So it's a passion, a strength that Moshe has, and it really proves that he is a principled leader. He's living by the ideals that Hashem had set out for him. Another example, I think Dr. Abraham Twersky mentions this. Another example where we see Moshe doing this is when Hashem has called him and told him to come to Mitzrayim at the burning bush, and Moshe gives all sorts of excuses. And then he also says to him, oh, by the way, I can't go until I ask my father-in-law Yisro for permission. And you think to yourself, like, well, that's a bit strange. Like, you're telling Hashem you need to get permission from a human being to go do what Hashem's telling you. And the answer is, well, yeah, actually, because those are the principles by which Hashem wants Moshe to lead the people, with a sense of respect, right? Moshe's father-in-law had taken him in. He had cared for him. He had supported him. He had, given him everything he needed to be a success and to make him a part of his family. It would be a sign of a lack of hakaras hatov, a lack of gratitude, a lack of appreciation if he were to just pick up and leave without giving his father-in-law the proper respect, something that we see Moshe doing consistently in his relationship with his father-in-law. And so we see, even though it seems funny to say, Hashem, let me just ask permission, or Hashem, I don't really believe you so much. I'm not going to take what you say so literally. That's actually what Hashem would have wanted. And it's just a further proof of the kinds of leadership that Moshe had and the kinds of leadership that we all want to aspire to, whether it's in our relationships with friends or with family members, that we want to be those people that live by our ideals, even when the facts seem to not necessarily indicate that the facts on the ground are so positive, but we want to hold strong until we're forced to face the reality that is not the case. And that is really one of the things that Moshe sets up for us. The last answer that I want to share is really something that I was bothering me for the last few weeks in the Parsha. And maybe I'll just share my screen one more time. We'll go back to last week's Parsha. Let me see if I can pull it up. Over the last few weeks, we've been discussing the Mishkan, and the Mishkan, the descriptions of both the building and the kalim, the vessels. There is a lot of detail. We discussed it a little bit over the last few weeks, but there's something I noticed, and I'd seen it before, but it never really quite jumped out at me like it did this year. And that is a mention about a lot of the different aspects, both the Mizbeach and different parts of the Mishkan, where the language that's used is, this should be as a kapara, lechaper al bnei Yisrael, as a source of atonement for the Jewish people. And it comes up quite often. Either it's very literally written, lechaper lebnei Yisrael, right? It's going to be there as a kapara. In fact, the psukim right before our parsha are talking about what's going to happen once a year when Aharon is going to bring kapara, atonement for the Jewish people. But if you go back, the farther you go back, the more you see this idea of atonement. And the other place that we see it, not so literally, but just sort of in the language, the way the Torah expresses itself, is in the idea of a kaporet. So we know the word kippur, kapara, lechaper is an atonement or to atone. The word kaporet, which is the exact same shoresh, it's the same letters, is referring to a cover. And specifically here, the kaporet refers to the cover on top of the aron upon which the kruvim were placed. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, it jumped out at me this year how every single time the aron is mentioned, kaporet, lifnei ha-kaporet, like everything is happening with this kaporet. So this shoresh of kapara comes up so often. And you sort of have the sense, at least I do, because when I think of Yom Kippur, when I think of the idea of kapara, I think that means somebody did something wrong. We don't need atonement if we've been behaving ourselves. So I just was like noticing over the last few weeks, as I mentioned, this idea, like, why is there so much talk about kapara? Like, we're talking about the Mishkan. The Mishkan was a place of perfection, right? I think my husband mentioned on Shabbos the idea that it was a place where you were reminded of the ideals that we can never reach, but we still never want to lose sight of how perfect things can be, how perfect we can be, even though we know we're never going to be perfect. But if we lose sight of our dreams, we lose sight of our ideals for ourselves, of the standard that we would like to achieve, well, then we'll just keep dropping the standards and this is something where First talks about. And then we won't even have the dream. And of course, we know, since we never meet our standard, if we keep dropping the standard because we've lost sight of the original standard, it doesn't bode so well, not for us and not for the generations that come after us. And so it's important to recognize when we don't meet expectations, even though we know we will never meet expectations, but that's okay. There has to be a time and a place where we're reminded of the goal, the ultimate, even if we're never going to get there. And that's really what the Mishkan represented. So it was odd to me that you constantly see this terminology of kapara, of atonement. And then in this week's Parsha, it's no different. It continues that Hashem is speaking to Moshe and he gives him the commandment to take a census of the Jewish people. Ki Tisa rosh bnei Yisrael, right? That he should raise up the heads of each person, and each person is going to give a half a shekel. And just look in these first few psukim of this Parsha, all of the different mentions of the word kapara. V'natznu ish kofer nafsho. Okay, right? There's the kapara. And then in the next pasuk, sorry, it's not here. The next one. Here it is. Pasuk Tzadvav. L'chaper al nafsho techem. They're going to give this half a shekel, and it's going to be a kapara. Like what? Did someone do something wrong? Did I miss it? The story, like we haven't been in a story mode. We've been in a teaching mode. Hashem has been talking to Moshe and teaching him all of the mitzvos, all of the things that have to happen, both related to the Mishkan and to the conduct of the Jewish people and the Kohanim and everything. Who is talking about kapara? Why do we need kapara already? And it just keeps going. Lifnei Hashem, l'chaper al nafsho sechem. Everything is going to happen in order to be a kapara for you. And again, it just keeps coming up within the context of the Parsha related to the Mishkan. And I just found that strange, since the Mishkan is supposed to be this place of happiness and perfection, and everybody's close. Hashem loves us and we love him and we're on our best behavior. What is all this talk of kapara? And I think maybe that is actually the answer to, our original question, or at least one approach to our original question, as to why did Moshe need to bring the luchos down with him when he already knew the Jewish people were sinning? Like, was this whole thing an act? Was it a show? Why did he feel the need to do this? And so the final answer that I want to focus on is based on this idea. Were it not for the fact that Moshe brought the luchos down and broke them in front of all of Bnei Israel and yelled at the Jewish people and chastised them and rebuked them, we would not have had the same experience, the same face-to-face with sin, with failure. Because maybe Moshe could have worked out the whole thing with Hashem ahead of time. They could have done the Jewish people and Moshe never would have had to face each other in this very intense way. And the result of Moshe literally shaking the Jewish people to their core when he broke the luchos, right? The Torah describes later on when he comes down with the second set that he has this light coming off of his face. I don't really know what that means, but he is somehow just supernatural looking. There's something about him that you could see this man has been spending a lot of time with Hashem. He didn't eat, he didn't drink, right? He is just on another level. He's this very, very spiritual being. What did he look like when he came down the first time? The Torah doesn't describe, but like we could imagine it wasn't this light and glow. He was angry. And what that forced was a confrontation between Moshe and the Jewish people that is highlighted by the fact that he breaks the luchos. And there is, and again, this is the relationship between Hashem and between Moshe and the Jewish people is what we would call like a halbatzara, right? That's only part of the problem. It's really the relationship between Hashem and the Jewish people that's the problem. But it's easier for us, I think, to understand and to see the dynamic between Moshe and the people. And the experience of us reading, and the Jewish people who actually lived through this, of being there and watching Moshe smash those luchos that he spent all that time on Har Sinai receiving from Hashem, that they were literally written by God himself. And Moshe is so incensed by what the people have done. He's so shocked. He can't believe it, that he breaks them in front of the people. And what that causes is a whole, that it's a cause and effect, a whole cycle that ends up becoming our paradigm for sin, leads to teshuvah and tefillah. And not only does it lead to a very intense level of introspection, soul searching, apology, regret, going through the whole process, commitment not to do it in the future and all of that, it allows us to see that it works. Because the whole story, as I mentioned before, we talk about it on Yom Kippur, but oh my gosh, the concept of tshuva is something we're supposed to be thinking about all the time. Some of us don't always think about it. I know I don't. We don't always think about it in relationship to our connection between us and Hashem, but we often we're forced to face it in our relationships with other people, where something goes on and we realize we need to fix, we need to make amends. And that process can be a very difficult, painful process. It requires a lot of energy, a lot of investment. It's awkward. It's not a simple thing, no matter which side you're on, right? Whether you are the offended or the offender. And usually we're a little bit of both. I think that's a fair statement to make. It's usually two parties. But what the breaking of the luchos shows us, why did Moshe have to bother? It's because it's a living, breathing example that people are going to fail. And when they fail, when they make a mistake, there's going to be a reaction, right? Things, as we mentioned, as my husband mentioned on Shabbos, and I just referred to, like when something happens that's not right, that's not okay, you have to say it. You have to speak it out. You can't pretend like, oh, let me just take care of it through the back channels. And then maybe it doesn't have to make it into the book. We could leave it out of the minutes. We could leave it out of the notes from the meeting. No. If something happens, we are all better off to face it head on, experience the shattering of the luchos, to not pretend that something terrible didn't happen, but to face the fact that something terrible happened, and then to go through the very difficult, but very necessary and productive process of teshuvah and tefillah. And without this shock of the breaking of the luchos, we don't necessarily know if the Jewish people would have gone through the proper formula, gone through the proper process of reconnecting with Hashem. And again, this is not just, I think, indicative of the human condition, that this is something we are going to have to face all the time. It's something that I think we need to face even in our most perfect place. And that just brings us back to what I was mentioning before about the constant mention of kapara. We're talking about a place that we hope nobody sins in the Mishkan. Like, it's one thing you sin in you do something in your house, but I don't know, when you're in shul, you're a little bit more careful. Imagine you were in the Mishkan. Imagine you were in the Beis HaMikdash. We're on our best behavior. We're really bringing our A game when we're in those places. And yet, the Torah is constantly talking about kapara within the walls of the Mishkan, within the people of the Kohanim, the people we have the highest, expectations of. But that's just it. The Mishkan was a perfect place, but it was for a real people, right? The purpose of the Mishkan was essentially to show us that Hashem is going to dwell amongst us. Hashem wants to stay with us, and he knows that we make mistakes. Like, the kapara was a part and parcel of the construction, the very foundation. I guess it didn't have a foundation. It was what's the word? Portable. But part of the philosophical foundation of the Mishkan was the idea of kapara. It's almost like before we could even make the mistake, Hashem is already saying, I'm going to give you a way back. I'm going to let you know that this could work out, right? I know who I'm dealing with. I know that you're not perfect. I made you, for goodness sake. I created you. It's like when a child comes to their parent and is embarrassed about something, or apologizing for something that they've done. And the parent deep down is thinking to themselves, like, this is not a surprise that you did this. I appreciate, and of course, out loud, what you say is, thank you so much for your apology. It really means a lot. Wow. It's amazing that you realized that was something that was hard for me. whatever, whatever wisdom we try to come up with. But the bottom line is we knew the kid was going to make that mistake. They'd done it 10 times before and they never apologized. The shock is that they apologized, not that they did the thing wrong. And so that's essentially the relationship that we have with Hashem. He gives us a Mishkan that is a place to uphold and to look up to our ideals where we can be perfect, but there's never a thought that we're actually going to be perfect. The Mishkan was made with real people in mind as a place where we could be reminded of the standards that we want to achieve, but with room for us to be the people that we are. And so even though this is a difficult period in our history, there's something about the sin of the golden calf, as upsetting as it is, as difficult as it is, the comfort in the back part of the story where the Jewish people turn back to Hashem and Moshe goes back up on the mountain and they have this beautiful, and we learn the 13, the Yud Gimel Midos Harachamim, the attributes of mercy. We realize that, oh my gosh, from now on, we have the ability to do tshuva. Now, we know tshuva was created well before this, but on a national level, I don't think there was such a thing as a nation, a group of people, certainly not the Jewish people, who had this experience of making a national mistake. And it's not that all the Jews necessarily participated, but we know that shtika kehodaya dami, that even the people who didn't actively participate, the fact that they didn't stop it from happening means that they were accomplices, right? It's not enough just to stand quietly by. A person needs to stand up and say something when something is not right. And so the whole experience is one that is very, it's a teaching moment for all of us. It's a good reminder that there is no such thing. Hashem doesn't expect us to be perfect. There is no such thing as perfection for a human being. And one of the ways that we see that is in Moshe choosing to break the luchos, which shows us that there is an expectation that things will go wrong. And when they do, that will hopefully set off a process of teshuvah, a process of tefillah. And that is essentially really what the Mishkan was all about, a place where we could reconnect and become the best version of ourselves, recognizing that we're almost never the best version of ourselves. So that was just one question with a couple of answers that I wanted to share with you. Again, thank you so much to Elizabeth and her family for sponsoring the share today. Again, your father's neshama should have an aliyah. You should celebrate simchas, and I wish you all a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. Thank you, Rebbetzin.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
We think
Good
you're
Shabbos.
perfect, Rebbetzin.
Let's all go make mistakes and then do tshuva for them, okay?
We think you're perfect. Elizabeth, may your father's neshama have an aliyah.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you.
Only good things.
Thanks, Rifki.
Made for everybody.
So beautiful.
Here, have a great Shabbos.